So what are accessorial charges? So accessorial charges are charges outside of the normal pickup and delivery agreement. Okay, so when you agree to pick up a shipment for a shipper from point A to point B, let's say it's Buffalo to Atlanta. That's always my famous example that I use. Okay, what happens is anything that's outside of that normal pickup and delivery, where it's one pick, one drop, everything goes perfect, is called an accessorial charge. Okay? And so these charges are incremental, and they're almost like individual charges based upon what happens. So I'm not going to go over every type of accessorial charge. I'm going to go over a few and give you some examples of accessorial charges because it's important that you understand that. One of the most famous, otherwise maybe known as infamous, charges, accessorial charges, is called detention. Okay, a detention charge. So what exactly is a detention charge? So let's use that example. A shipper asked me to pick up a load from point A to point B, Buffalo to Atlanta. Okay, it's a van load. We're just going to use that as an example. And I then find one of my carriers to haul that load. I dispatch the driver into the pickup location, and for whatever reason, he's sitting in line trying to get loaded. Maybe the shipper is behind. Maybe the load isn't ready. Any number of reasons, but they don't get him loaded quickly. Typically, in any given load, what you're going to get is you're going to get about 2 hours of free time to load and unload the truck for the entire load. Okay, that's kind of an acceptable norm, about 2 hours. Okay, so that means the shipper has 2 hours to load and unload you. Anything after 2 hours would be considered detention time. And what that is that's a charge that's paid to the carrier for their time. What you have to understand is that when a carrier's wheels are not moving, if their wheels are not moving and they're not putting miles on their truck, they're losing money. Sitting still is the equivalent of losing money. So a detention charge is a way to try to offset some of those losses. Now, typically, detention charges range from $50 to about $75 per hour. And it's typically broken down in 15-minute increments, okay? So if, they're detained for a half an hour beyond the 2 hours or an hour beyond the 2 hours or 2.5 hours, you would fractionalize it down to somewhere between $50 and $75 per hour, okay? That's an example. So if they went 2 hours beyond the normal 2 hour load unload time throughout the entire load, what would happen is that carrier would be due 2 times whatever the accessorial charge is, probably let's say it's $50. That means the carrier would get an extra $100 for that load above and beyond the agreed rate. Welcome Art. Welcome Art from Bakersfield. Welcome Ken from Wisconsin. Welcome guys. Awesome. So that's an example of an accessorial charge. Other accessorial charges that you'll hear about regularly is stop charges. So, say for example, you have a multi-pick or a multi-drop load where rather than just picking up in Atlanta or Buffalo and delivering to Atlanta, maybe they pick up in Atlanta, then they pick up in Cleveland, then they deliver in Raleigh, and they also deliver in Atlanta, right? So that's a 4-stop load, right? Or 2-pick, 2 stops. So there would be some accessorial charges there. Stop charges typically range somewhere between $50 and $100 for the first stop, and then each additional stop beyond the original stop and the delivery, every additional one, so those 2 extra stops, would typically be, the first one would be somewhere between $50 and $100 per load, and then they start to go up from there, maybe $100 to $150 for the next stop, and then maybe $200 to $250 for the next stop. Okay, so they accelerate. The more stops you have, the higher the stop charge is. Okay, so these are just examples. I'm not giving this to you as an example of exactly what to charge, even though these are pretty reasonable rates. I'm giving you these examples so I want you to understand what exactly is an accessorial charge. Okay, so if the idea of detention of an accessorial charge, does my explanation of detention charges make sense? If it makes sense to you, please type yes in the chat box. I'd love to hear back. I want to make sure that you guys fully understand exactly what an accessorial charge is, and particularly using that example that I gave you of detention, because detention is the one that you're going to run into most often, okay? So John agrees. We got some thumbs up. Laszlo agrees. Any carriers in here? Any carriers in here that are want to chime in on detention? I'm sure that's a sensitive spot. Peter agrees. Bobby from Power, Arkansas. Welcome. Oh, welcome from Arkansas, Bobby. Ken agrees. What's the standard rate for detention, Peter? Standard rate for detention that I give you is typically somewhere around in the $50 to $75 per hour range. Some may be a little more, but typically that's the standard, $50 to $75 per hour. Erica understands, so that's great. Okay, Peter. Peter loves detention, right? So that's an example of what an accessorial charge is. An accessorial charge is any charge outside of the normal pickup and delivery. Detention would be an accessorial charge. Driver layover would be an additional charge. Truck ordered not used would be an additional charge. Let's talk about truck ordered not used really quick. This is one that's kind of a sensitive topic, right? So an example of truck ordered not used is this. The shipper gives me a shipment that picks up from Buffalo to Atlanta. I find a carrier to haul that shipment. We agreed. The deal is all signed. And then what happens, I dispatch the driver into the pickup location. And from the point that I dispatch that driver in, for some reason, the shipper either cancels the load because it's not ready, or there was a miscommunication, or whatever the case may be. But if I dispatch the driver into that pickup location and he does not get loaded for whatever reason, unless it's his fault, okay? If he doesn't get loaded for whatever reason, again, unless it's his fault, if he shows up really late or whatever, then that's his issue. But example is what would be paid at that point is the shipper would owe a truck ordered not used. So it's like a canceled order, but you still have to pay the driver, pay the carrier. And truck ordered not used typically range somewhere between $150 and $250 per incident. So what would happen is the shipper would then pay that $150 to $250 to the broker, and the broker would then give that to the carrier for their time. Because again, if their wheels are not turning and they're not getting paid a per mile rate, well, then they're obviously losing money. So that's an example of an accessorial charge, okay? So I've given you a few accessorial charges. There's tons of accessorial charges out there, and they can vary from mode. Like truckload has their own set of accessorial charges. LTL has their own set of accessorial charges. Rail has their own. Ocean has their own. Air freight. All these different modes of transportation have their own different and unique accessorial charges. I was talking to you predominantly about full truckload. Okay, I want to clarify that for you. Make sure you guys understand that. It's real important. Okay, so now that we've talked about what is an accessorial charge, I'm going to give you 5 best practices. Okay, I'm going to give you 5 tips on exactly how you as a freight broker should handle your accessorial charges. All right, number 1 is this. You should always try to get your shipper, whoever your customer is, as the broker, you should always try to get something in writing from them up front before moving your first load that defines the accessorial charges. Now that can either be in your shipper contract, where you can add accessorial charges in there if they're willing to sign that, or in a lot of cases, shippers will have their own accessorial charges that they'll give to you, and they'll let you know, here's what we pay for detention, here's what we pay for truck ordered not used, here's what we pay for this, here's what we pay for that. And so there'll be transparency. You guys want to have an understanding of exactly what the charges are going to be. Now, you're not always going to agree on these charges. A shipper may come in and say, well, we only pay, $100 per truck ordered not used. I would urge you to try to negotiate that if you think that is low. you may be able to get them to agree to $150 per truck ordered not used. Or if they're saying they'll only pay $40 an hour for detention, negotiate $50 or $60 for detention, okay? You can do that. Now, you're not always going to win, but the fact is that sometimes shippers will lowball you a little bit on the accessorials because accessorials can get really expensive and mistakes happen, okay? So number one best practice is have transparency and be very, very clear and have something documented with your shippers on what those accessorial charges are. Don't say, oh, I'll worry about it on the back end, because after it happens, that's when you run into issues, right? That's when it's the he said, she said, well, we never agreed to accessorials, and then all of a sudden you still have to pay the carrier because you agreed to accessorials with the carrier, in your carrier agreement, and now all of a sudden you're losing money as the broker, okay? So you want to make sure that with your shipper, you define the accessorials up front. Typically, in more than half the cases, they're going to give you an accessorial sheet that they have, which are their standard accessorials. So, and you can try to negotiate that a little bit as needed. Most shippers are pretty fair with the common accessorials, okay? That's number one. Number two is you need to make sure that as a part of your carrier contract or as a part of your rate confirmation or as a part of your communications with your carrier, whether that be an owner-operator, whether that be a small fleet, whether that be a Swift or Warner or any of the large transportation companies out there, you need to define those accessorials with your carrier as well. And you're best doing that up front, okay? So what I strongly suggest with every carrier you do business with is that you include an appendix, like an Appendix A, to your carrier contract, which defines your accessorials. That gives them the ability to review them up front, negotiate them if they feel the need, and when they sign the contract, they've now agreed that these are the accessorial charges. And what you would typically want to do is whatever your standard accessorial charges with your shippers are, is the same thing that you would get, that you would pay your carriers, okay? Okay, so you want to make sure you have transparency with not only the shipper, but also with the carrier. So it's real easy, and there's not a lot of tension when everybody's agreed up front to what those charges are, okay? But you can imagine how tempers can flare and incidents can get escalated when a carrier doesn't think they're going to get paid their detention or a truck order not used, and when a shipper, can kind of hold you over a barrel because you guys didn't negotiate that up front. So make sure you establish that on both ends, shipper and carrier, okay? So that's number two. Number three is communicate, communicate, communicate. Now, I can't say that enough, okay? You have to be very proactive in your communications with everybody, with your carrier, with your shipper, with your driver, with the dock, with everybody. You need to over-communicate when these situations arise. There are very few situations that cannot be resolved with good communications. And this is where a lot of these situations break down, okay? So here's an example. I dispatched the driver for that load from Buffalo to Atlanta. I dispatched the driver into the pickup location in Buffalo. And the driver, he's almost 2 hours into sitting there, and he calls us or calls his dispatcher. We get notified by him or the carrier that he hasn't gotten loaded yet. Okay? What should be the first thing we should do as a broker? The first thing we should do is call our shipper. Call our shipper and let him know, whether that be the contact at the dock, whether that be your load planner, your traffic manager, whoever those connections are, and letting them know that after 2 hours, detention is about to start and it's on this load. Here's the load ID or whatever the load number is or whatever the shipment order or the BOL or whatever tracking you have. Let them know that after 2 hours, the detention is going to start going and it's X dollars per hour. You got to remind them, okay? And you got to kind of grease that wheel a little bit. So that's proactive. And then after about every half an hour, you should communicate again with that shipper, if the driver is not loaded, you should communicate with that shipper about every half an hour and let him know, driver's not loaded yet, been a half an hour. Driver's not loaded yet, been an hour. Driver's not loaded yet, been whatever number of time it is, okay? Because you want them to understand that the clock is ticking. And typically what's going to happen is that shipper is going to call down to the dock and they're going to get that truck loaded, okay, if at all possible, okay? So with that, that's an example of being proactive and communicating, all right? Now that's on the broker side. The opposite of that is, carrier calls you, says they're not loaded yet, it's almost been 2 hours, and then you just get busy and you sit on it. And then an hour, 2 hours later, the driver's still not loaded, and you decide now you're going to call the shipper. Now, the shipper has every right to be a little bit pissed at that point, and here's why. Even though it was their mistake, they do request, and it's best practice to always let your shipper know when detention is going to begin and keep them updated along the way. Remember, you work for that shipper, and your job, you're getting paid by that shipper, so you need to communicate what exactly is going on. So that's what I mean by communicate throughout the entire process. It's not just one time. It's not after it happens. It's communicate. Okay, so that's number 3. All right, often and early. That's my suggestion. All right, number 4. The number 4 best practice is this: when accessorials happen with your shipper, okay, when accessorial charges happen, because they're going to happen, just know detention's going to happen, truck order not used are going to happen, reconsignment, these things are going to happen. It happens throughout the logistics process, okay, throughout the supply chain. When they happen, after it's done and it's all completed, so let's take that detention example. After it's done, you want to get something in writing, typically via email, from that shipper that shows and agrees to X. So if it took them an extra hour to load that driver in Buffalo, and the shipper agreed, okay, he was delayed an hour, here's an hour of detention, get him to send you an email, have him send you an email and say, yes, on XYZ load, driver was detained 1 hour, broker due $50 per accessorials. The reason why I suggest you do that is because you got to understand something. People on the dock, most shippers are juggling, in any given day they might be juggling 10, 20, 50, 100 loads in a day. And by the time they get that bill, which is going to be probably at least a couple weeks later, a week to 2 weeks later, okay? And by the time that bill comes due, nobody's going to remember what he said, she said, we said, okay? It's just not. So you need to document with your shipper when accessorial charges happen. I would strongly suggest, now not all shippers are going to do this for you, but if you ask them, hey guys, do me a favor, can you just shoot me an email? We agreed that it's 1 hour detention on this load, it's $50, and then, include that or keep that as backup documentation for the billing later. Because in some cases, you might submit your bill with that detention charge and agree to pay your carrier that detention charge. But then what happens is your shipper doesn't pay you that detention charge and they'll refuse it. And then all of a sudden it becomes a debate. If you have this documentation from your shipper in an email format that says John Doe agreed at this date and time to pay 1 hour of detention on XYZ load for $50, bam, it's all resolved. You show them that, bing, bang, boom, there's not going to be any issues. You're going to get paid, okay? That's number 4. Last but not least in these tips, and before you guys sign off, hang on here to the end. I want to share something with you, okay? It's important that you hang on. This is number 5. The best practice that I recommend, and this is not how all brokers do business, but this is how I recommend you do business, is that all accessorial charges are a straight pass-through to the carrier. Now, what do I mean by that? That means that if a shipper pays me $50 for 1 hour of detention on that load, then that $50 goes directly and 100% through to the carrier. If there's a truck ordered not used and the carrier and the shipper agrees to pay me $150 for a truck ordered not used because that truck didn't get used, like I explained to you, that whole $150 goes through to the carrier. Okay? If there's a reconsignment charge. So whatever the accessorial charges are, my suggestion in good faith and as a best practice as a broker or agent, what you need to do is you need to pass 100% of that accessorial charges through there. It should not be a profit center for you, the broker. It doesn't need to be a profit center, okay? Part of your job is to manage that freight from cradle to grave, okay? From A to Z. And so part of that is dealing with accessorial charges. So you should not use accessorial charges as a way to increase your margin, okay? And some brokers are going to disagree with me. I don't really care. This is the way that I do it. This is the carrier-friendly way. This is the shipper-friendly way. This is the way that smart brokers will do it because it's more of a partnership with those carriers. You're not trying to take money out of a carrier's pocket. You're trying to make sure that they're paid for their time. And those accessorial charges, trust me, are very, very important to carriers and drivers, okay? So those are the 5 best practices. If you guys enjoyed this training, do me a huge favor, give me some thumbs up, share the stream, and I'm going to have a couple minutes for some Q&A. I don't think we've been on here for a long time, but I do want to try to handle some Q&A if there is any, I should say. We've been on here for, well, I can't really tell, but we've got quite a few people on the live stream. That's awesome. Oh, listen, I'm glad you guys enjoy it. That's awesome. This is the time. I've never talked about this. I never did a blog post. I never did a video. This is the first time I've ever done an outside training, a free training on this topic. It's an important topic, okay? Because it happens all the time. Trust me when I tell you, you are going to run into this. And it's not a big deal. If you follow those 5 tips, those 5 best practices I gave you, be transparent with your shipper, be transparent with your carrier, communicate, which is number 3. When there is an accessorial, get your shipper to email you the agreed upon accessorial charge and what it's about, the 2 hours of detention. And then number 5 is don't use accessorial charges as a profit center for brokers. Pass them through directly to the carrier 100%. Okay? So with that in mind, I'm going to try to jump in and do some Q&A here. So let's see what we got. I got to look at my main screen here because I got to refresh this because sometimes it's hard to see the questions. Okay. All right, let's see what we got. All right. Who pays lumber fees? Do you mean lumber fees? Okay. I think you probably mean lumber fees. Lumper fees is another term for load unload charges. So that would be defined upfront with your shipper if they're willing to pay a load unload fee. Typically, you're going to need to know because on the other side, if the pickup or drop location charges a load unload fee, you're definitely going to need to charge that to a shipper. In most cases, when a shipper is going into a pickup or delivery location that charges it, they're aware of that up front, and you can negotiate that load unload fee up front. Okay, so that is an example of a detention fee, okay, of a detention charge. So that's also something that you would want to build into your accessorial sheet that you could negotiate with your shipper and also have some transparency with your carrier, okay? Sometimes lumper, the drivers will sometimes want to lump the load. They'll want to load unload. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the drivers use it as extra cash. They like it. Sometimes there'll be a lumper service that'll be a load unload service. It'll just be independent contractors that'll be there that'll load and unload trucks. So it varies from location to location, okay? So what else we got here? What if a load gets refused? Peter Fournier. What if a load gets refused? Okay, so this is an example of where you would probably run into a reconsignment, or you would run into some extra miles, some out of route miles. Okay, so if we picked it up in Buffalo, and we needed to deliver it into Atlanta. And then when they get to the pickup location in Atlanta, they refuse the freight, and they say, listen, this isn't our freight. Once the shipper, okay, number one, from that point, after 2 hours, the detention is going to start running. The shipper then makes a decision on what they want to do with that load. They may say, okay, hey, I want you to run it over to this little town just outside of Atlanta. It's 50 miles away. And at that point, you guys would get, you would negotiate an out of route miles. Okay, so there'd be some mileage paid, and there would also be a reconsignment fee. And that reconsignment fee is typically something that would be negotiated in your accessorial charges. Reconsignment fees can vary significantly, but in most cases, you're probably talking somewhere in the range of $50 to $150 for a reconsignment fee, depending upon the miles and the inconvenience, okay? So that's an example of what you would do if they reject the load. If the shipper doesn't get back to you, that detention time is going to start to add up, and then that's going to be an issue. They need to find a place for that load. If they're going to warehouse it, cross-dock it, or whatever they're going to do, but the shipper needs to find a solution so that the carrier can get that load off their truck so they don't miss their next load, okay? Very important. Let's see. Sometimes the carrier will pay up front and reimbursed by the shipper. Yeah. So in a lumper situation, that's a lot of times what will happen. Other questions. Let's see. What other questions do we have, guys? What other questions do we have? Okay. Do you have any or do any seminars that we may go to? Justin's asking for seminars. These are the weekly trainings that I do. These are kind of like webinars. I do have other webinars that I do. They're typically a little longer, and there's a lot more information shared. But this is the weekly training that I do. You could go to my blog at freightbrokerbootcamp.com/blog. There's a lot of free training there. You could also go to check out my course and try to see some of the information there. That's an online course. It's a self-study, go at your own pace course. You just go to freightbrokerbootcamp.com and you can check that out. So I'm not sure. So sounds to me like you guys, this was a good lesson. You guys got a lot out of it. Do me a favor, share the stream. I want to thank everybody who attended this live. The audience from week to week to week seems to get bigger and bigger and bigger. I didn't even send out an email this week letting everybody know that, to jump on the training. I got tied up. So everybody that's in this training right now, you guys have been coming in and paying attention and getting these lessons. I'm proud of you guys for participating. You guys had some good questions. Listen, share the stream. Give me some likes and comments. If you're catching this on replay and it's not live, feel free to put your questions in the chat box. I do come back in here throughout the week, and I will respond sometimes in the thread. Sometimes, I'll respond in the and I'll PM you or private message you a response. But I want to thank you guys for joining me today. Remember, every Monday at noon Eastern Time, we're going to be doing more of this free freight broker training. So stay tuned, and we'll see you next week.